Welcome back to That Which Sleeps, the game where you play as an ancient evil intent on returning to take control of the world. Today we're going to talk about some of the basic attributes of the game, so I'm going to jump right in and open up one of the detail panes on location. Here we see cultures. Cultures are one of the most important elements of the game. While governments come and go in That Which Sleeps, the cultures remain. Cultures are a container both for the awareness of what's going on in the world and also the eldritch and lost arts that the AI can use to counter the player's actions. As such, destroying, corrupting, or keeping cultures apart from each other is one of the most important elements of the game to restrict the AI's ability to counter what you're doing. Let's take a look at the panel. You see we have 3 cultures listed here. A location can contain anywhere from 3 to 6 cultures that are properly represented. If there's any more than that, they will be smushed into a final bucket group that has no effect on the location. The amount of cultures a location wants to permit depends on the tolerance of the primary culture. And we see stats below privileged culture. The government that controls this location can set a culture to be the privileged culture, which gives it a bonus to growth, conversion, and to spawning notables. Conversion below is the rate at which this culture is assimilating other cultures. Awareness is the raw value of suspicion that this culture has that something's not quite right with the world around it. Desperation is a value that allows the AI to be more flexible in its choices. Generally speaking, the AI has a variety of actions it can take to respond to a given threat. Most of these are fairly mundane. But as desperation grows, so too does the options the AI has to deal with it. For instance, if your army was taking over a large city and they had no chance of defeating it, a desperate AI might decide to blow up the city and your army with it, if it has that ability. Perversion is a rate for how many paths of the ancients they have adopted and how far they've gone down them. When perversion is high, what happens is that the cultural traits that make up the culture begin to become their perverted versions of themselves, generally twisting them in a direction that is at first beneficial for them, but in the end makes them something closer to one of the eldritch factions and much easier to corrupt. Resilience is the rate at which they can reverse their perversions. So if they go down the trait a few steps, one of the cultural traits a few steps, and then they fight and win a war, with resilience they can kind of roll back and become somewhat normalized again. Fascination is the rate at which they will examine any eldritch art they encounter or any other artifact or any residue of a greater faction. High levels of fascination mean they're essentially forced to do it. They can't say no even if it's clearly against their best interest. But at low levels of fascination, even a beneficial item might be ignored by the AI. Below that, we're going to see Affinities and Factions. So Affinities and Factions, while they might look like very simple ratings at the bottom for cultures, they are in fact very important to the location as a whole. Affinities are the local modifier to the global value for this culture on what kind of people are spawned here. So if we jump over to the character page, you're going to see upcoming at the bottom. So when there's an upcoming person, it will determine they get 2 basic archetypes, and from their basic archetypes they'll get a subclass derived that affects what they can do as an action and what bonuses they give to this location. So when you see something like Merchant, Admiral, Diplomat, Cultist, these are saying there's a much higher chance that a merchant shows up here and a much lower chance that a commander shows up here, for example. Factions are sort of like the health and hit points for the actions that resolve. Every faction that is generated has a loyalty and a strength. Strength is on the right side, loyalty is denoted by the color. When a faction has a certain amount of strength and an event that triggers that faction resolves, it will consume some of that faction's strength to strengthen the event itself. The major use of faction is for revolution, which is the crisis event for Unrest. If a revolt occurs, it will check the strength of the loyalists versus the strength of the rebels. They'll lose strength from either side, and whoever's left remaining will determine if it was a very successful revolution, the local government is destroyed, or if the loyalists survive and the rebels are crushed. However, after that battle result happens, the rebels will always gain a certain amount of strength. In this way, even causing minor unrest events will eventually stack the deck for the rebels so that you can eventually cause a fully successful revolution. Now, just to talk a moment about how some of these crisis events can modify the way in which the game works. For instance, if a revolution occurred and you also had madness at tier 3, 200 strength or above, it triggers a special crisis where all those factions are randomized. So with madness, rebels could be completely loyal, sages could be disloyal, and you might have a very strange result coming from that revolution. For instance, even though this is a noble republic, a merchant republic, you might end up with, for instance, theocrats creating a new theocratic government in that location, which, of course, the place would then hate, but still, that's part of the joy of spreading madness. So moving on to our next one, we see religions. Some places play a lot with religion, some places do a lot less. Looking here, we see faith. Faith is an example, is how much faith is generated per turn, which is essentially the mana for the divine spells and miracles. Piety is how much this religion actually responds to its own traits. High levels of piety mean that you're going to have pretty much everyone who follows it have some of the divine traits. Low levels mean that they really don't care what anyone says, and there'll be very little, even if it's spread all the way across, it's really just a unifying force for the culture. Heresy is how much discord there is inside the religion. Its mechanics are, if an event triggers for a religious event triggers, a part of resolve, and the person, if with a kind of heresy, can spawn a new religion that schisms off the main one. The other element is if heresy just gets high enough no matter what. Anytime a religious resolve event triggers, heresy will be consumed, and it will result in cultists in all the locations that have heresy of that religion. So it's a good way to spread cultists, pretty low effort. Conversion is how quickly they are converting other members of other religions in this location. Fervor is how zealous they are. High fervor will create the religious zeal status effect. It will also impact how many people arrive at grand miracles. Apostasy is actually people going to a global Gnostic religion, which just means they'll worship no one, they contribute nothing to faith, though they are a bit more resistant to being corrupted. Demographics. So, demographics population growth is pretty self-explanatory. It depends on a variety of factors that we'll go through. Creatures, how many creatures are local. It will not show hidden creatures, so if we go back and take a look at what's here, we'll see one public creature, ghouls, but we won't see any hidden creatures. So a lot of creatures have the infiltrator ability, which means that they can go into cities and remain hidden. You won't see orcs or other monstrous creatures inside cities. You'll generally only see either these hidden ones or scavenger types like ghouls. Control represents what strength the administrative center has in this location. Because this is a capital city, it is the administrative center, so it doesn't have a control value. High levels of control mean that the administrative center makes all the decisions. Low levels mean that the locals do, and it gives them a much higher chance of successfully revolting and declaring independence from their administrative center. Stability is a value used only by the AI and is derived from the current stats of the location. So you see stability here is 6. It goes from 10 to negative 10. Now all it does is tell the AI, should I look at this in depth? The base way the AI responds is to say, hey, what's going on here? What's the worst, highest value thing? Let's respond to that. But if there's enough of that and it goes down to the negatives, the AI will say, well, let's look in depth. And that does matter a lot to the player because you're going to be spreading lots of these somewhat subtle effects that are changing things. If stability is still high with those, they'll never really look too deeply and say what's actually going on here. But if stability is low, they'll send one of the characters in to take a look and say, well, look, there's 5 of these special events spreading something. I think maybe something's wrong here. Let's look for an agent. Social unrest. Social unrest is an aggregate of a bunch of different factors that represents how the people are feeling in this location, and it adds or subtracts from unrest depending on the situation. Habitability affects the population growth, how many people can live here, and also if creatures will come in here. More creatures here will lower habitability, larger populations, the worse the terrain is. Density modifier is how many people here live here currently and what the modifier is to global productivity. Now you see on the right, political resolve. With resolve, that actually is the same as this bar in the upper left. So resolve events are very important. When a resolve event triggers, it's either political, religious, military, and it checks for the person with the highest skill in that relevant factor. The person with the highest skill gets to take a very important resolve action, which can have global effects for its culture or nation, as well as very powerful local effects. These can be either positive if they want things to succeed, or negative if they're insane or if they're being controlled by you. you'll see a list of people who can do it in order. So it goes to the top person, and it just shows their willpower here because they all cost willpower. All the way down to the lowest, and if people decline, it just keeps going until it gets to the lowest person who actually wants to consume some willpower to do an event. You also see policies here. So you'll see policies on all these pages: immigration, creature relations. If you have the control, these are the local control, military control, underworld control, religious control, you can change those. So the reason they're here and not inside the political screen is because political things take many turns to resolve, and we'll see that in a little bit, whereas policies can be changed every turn if you'd like. Captive slaves, refugees, that's how many of those they can hold here. This comes into play in certain nations a lot, and other nations almost not at all. But mid-game, if you're waging a lot of war, it will certainly come into play. Food. So food change, storage, modified food is important. That means if someone has altered the food that's coming into this place or leaving this location. Part of the reason we implemented resources the way that we did is because we want you to be able to mess around with food supplies, curse ore, and all of that, and have that spread throughout the land. And so modified food represents, hey, there's some of that going on and should be looked at. Diversity desire is based on the culture stats and also the population. They want a certain number of different foods, otherwise they get a little unhappy. There's only 2 kinds of food coming in here, so there'll be some negative impact on happiness. Health is based on just the amount of food coming in, and gives a modifier to population growth as well as garrison strength per turn. Spoilage is how much is lost per turn. Productivity, every one of these you'll see productivity, and that represents just a global modifier to how much is produced here. You also see in the upper right the 4 locations that are providing food here. All of those are claimed. So the way it works is that any city or capital is called an administrative center, and they claim local settlements around them. Whenever they claim one, that settlement sends its bonus food, gold, and other goods to the main administrative center. And they then use them for the entire region. So they've claimed these 4 places. You'll also see developments. You're also going to see everywhere. Developments are the way in which the game locations upgrade themselves. So originally we had buildings on the right for all different types, but it was getting very cluttered, and since they're not particularly meaningful to you, they're mostly a way for the world to customize itself and respond to threats. These are developed. It costs gold to create or update them, and this bar is what determines what can be upgraded and also what the cost will be. So what you see here is the lighter green bar is the total potential, and that's determined by the available labor pool. The brighter green bar is what's actually been achieved so far. What happens is, as long as you have labor, it will slowly increase this bar. If labor decreases, either because the army's been mobilized or if because you've killed people or they've gotten sick, the bar will start to shrink, lowering the effectiveness of the upgrades and also increasing their cost. You can see this one has a base cost of 2,000, but since it's slightly above the bar, it costs a bit less. The base costs are pretty high. These are meant to be big rewards for the location when they do achieve a certain level of peaceful development and to incentivize you to spread discord as much as possible. At the bottom we're going to see resources. We'll talk about resources when we get to the resource pane more specifically. Trade. So trade is the number one way to create massive amounts of wealth in the game, much more than just raising local taxes. Trade has gone through several iterations, but the way it works is that a location will trade with any other location that is not hostile or at war or vendetta within its trade range. Trade range is much larger for coastal cities and settlements than it is for land-based. Every place has a trade value that's based on its commercial development, its labor pool, and its own production and claiming of luxury and strategic goods. And it will compare itself with the other locations and will get the lowest of the 2 trade values. So you can see West Lundus must have 3.5 as its value, as it hasn't reached the 4.1. These values are all added up and gained by the trading partner. So you can see how it creates so much more wealth than local taxes. Part of the reason we implement it this way is because it really incentivizes you to disrupt trade as a massive blow to how much money is being generated by a bunch of powers at the same time. If you can shut down some of these naval zones in between these nations, these places will go from generating 50, 60 a turn down to 10 or 20 right away, which not only will cause them problems in production, it will also cause their merchant class to get very close or slip into revolt. Market strength is what determines how they pull resources. The way it works is every nation that can trade with one another makes its resources available, and then going down in strength from top to bottom, locations can pull a resource based on their market strength. So in other words, it looks at the pool of available resources and says, well, that's the one I want the most. It pulls that, then it goes to the next, and so on and so forth. This is how many goods they currently have here. Satisfaction is that they want a certain amount based on their cultural trait and their population and wealth. And productivity is, again, we'll see that in every single location. So trade goods, let's wait till we get to the trade pane itself. Production. Domestic labor. Labor does everything in the game for creation. Gold is used for civic developments, but almost anything else can be built just through labor. Some locations will have tons of slaves, friendly creature modifiers, rituals, all aiding in the construction. Others will just use what we see here, domestic labor and institutional labor. So you can also see the production in the upper right of all claimed locations as well as itself and what it's creating for strategic, luxury, and esoteric resources. Jumping down to goods, here we see strategic, luxury, and esoteric. These are the three main types of resources with several subtypes within them. You're going to see arrows on all of these that point different direction. So coming from the bottom, that's called claiming. Claiming means you're taking it from a lesser location. Anytime an administrative center has a claim location, they will always by default claim that settlements. The color matters. Orange signifies a basic claim of administrative. Green signifies a peaceful relation. So in other words, someone could be gifting it to you, and you'll see here these are being traded out to someone. And here we have things being traded in to New Caledon, so that's the left side. The color can also be red. Red means it's been won in war. So if you've taken a settlement and now you're just extracting the resource from them, it'll be red. So the reason this comes through three-sided places is because we wanted the resources to have an effect on a variety of areas without creating too many redundant instances of the resource. So this represents, if I were to go to Taras and if I were to cast a spell on this iron to make it brittle, it would affect Taras, New Caledon, and Cargenhold. All three of those places would get a penalty to the military production and to the armies that are being supplied by this iron. Luxury goods are pretty much used to make nobles happy and also to increase local trade strength and gold per turn. Esoteric goods are the more interesting ones. These usually don't come from domestic production. These usually come either from abundant ruins or from another local location that has a bizarre, peaceful, esoteric creature modifier that's located there that's trading. They have much stranger bonuses than these other ones and often spread things like cultist affinity. Military, you can see garrison strength here. Garrison strength, the base, is actually very, very important, actually the total garrison size. A lot of calculations derive from that. So the larger the garrison, the more guys are reinforced per turn, the more they can send out to the armies, the faster they can train elite units. So just seeing that garrison size increase is a big deal. Growth rate, reinforcement rate is how many guys are reinforced per turn. Available is important. Available is how many this location can, or rather will, send to an army it wants to reinforce. So the way it works is you can set how many people you want to maintain for your garrison. So border garrisons will often maintain up to 50% of the people, but they can set that down if they want to 25, 10%, and send everyone out to the armies within their deployment range to go fully on the offense. Usually you'll want them, or they'll want to keep 50% in major areas because you can be much more versatile in your deployments than the basic AI can. And so tricking them to lowering their garrison level is a great way to launch a surprise attack. Satisfaction is just this place wants a certain number of troops to be there, otherwise they feel it raises unrest and goes back to social unrest. Morale and organization are two basic stats for armies that determine how strong they'll be and how much they resist being hit by terror attacks. So down at the bottom you can see elite units. Elite units, the way the game works for military, whenever a unit attacks a hostile location, it's called a campaign. Campaigns can take anywhere from 3 to 100 turns, depending on the composition of the forces, the terrain, and what's being used against them. When a defensive force resists an attacker, what happens is a battle, and battles are determined by the participation of heroes and elite units. So they have basic bonuses they can add to the army, as well as they have basic types, stats, and traits. All of these things go into an interplay in combat to determine who wins the battle. You're trying to achieve breakthroughs, which allows you to smash through the enemy lines and advance much more rapidly. Retreats or routes. Routes are the most devastating. If you can turn a retreat into a rout, you've essentially wiped out the enemy force. but it is much harder to do. This is just showing the military stats for current and where their current armies they're supplying. Every army is supplied by a given administrative center. These are for navies. Navies also have elite units, although there's far fewer for mundane ones. There's plenty for more eldritch and monstrous elite units, but the basic ones, there's only about 5 for the Navy. Marines are pretty common for naval powers. It's almost impossible to do a naval assault without human Marines, or any kind of Marine. Mercenaries, some places do have a lot of mercenaries, some places have none because they outlaw it right away. Lore. So it's saying 16 sages, it's saying 60 people that are capable of doing research here. Identification, this is the base percentage for doing any kind of lore-based action. Most places will be below 100%, but the other places that do endorse sages and that do follow the lore upgrade path will have huge bonuses to those. Sorcery is the, if anyone uses a ritual here, you or the AI, this will affect the amount of sorcery that they generate to upgrade their rituals. At the bottom you see experiments. Experiments is when a player or an AI has a lost art, they might want to create something out of it. Often it will fail multiple times, so it moves in steps. These go into the experiment section, and they can be sabotaged by you or the AI while in progress. If it succeeds a few times, that new lost art innovation is created. Essence is the mana of the game. It's used in grand rituals and also in some minor rituals. Essence is generated mostly by passive deaths from a location. The higher the population, the more essence. It's also generated by special things like having mana wells nearby. Essence is drained. It drains to nearby nodes and gates. So you see in the upper right, the Corded Bone Elfinware, those are both primal nodes or limal nodes. They drain energy back into the Ancients. And the Path of Glory is a gate to the planes. It drains energy up to the gods. Also there's some loss to wild magic as well as Restless Dead. That's not always, but sometimes. How much faith they have generated here in total. And Primal Raw control and generation is only if there's a node present. So if someone has a node here, they can extract the power from it, sending it either to an individual or to an ancient. Below you see institutions, but we're going to see that in more detail when we go to the institution pane itself. Esoterica is how many relics, tomes, ancient rites. So if we just jump over here briefly, you can see these are the public ones. They can be hidden as well. We only have a value of 60 to find them. So tomes and relics are the same thing. See how there's green and red dots? If we jump over to the actual lore page, we'll see how they combine. So the Age of the Masters here has the most green dots. It has the highest possible cap to research for someone researching that era. Also on this page, you'd see underneath any publicly known or known by your infiltration lost arts or eldritch traits that are possessed by this location. But currently there are none here. They actually don't have any artifacts here, so they probably have none. And ancient rites that are here, it says there's one ancient rite. We will see that in detail in the next screen. So if you jump down here, you can see the ancient rites that are present. Ancient rites are how you corrupt a culture, or more specifically just a location. And spirit shows priests, people that can potentially call for miracles. Cultists, icons, holy sites. These icons and holy sites are the equivalent in faith as the nodes and artifacts are on the lore side. Two religions have built shrines here. There are no omens. Omens, I think I missed talking about this on the religion page. Omens are the way the gods talk to people. The gods can't just go and say, hey, there's an ancient horizon, go over there and stop them, but they can put omens down saying, hey, go to this spot, look into this spot, something bad's happening here. And anyone that follows that religion will feel more inclined to go there, so they can guide the AI in the right direction. And finally, you have any clues that are here. Clues decline over time. This shows any actions that have been taken. Both will move down at about 0.25 per turn is the profile loss. So that 10 one would last for 40 turns before gone. At base, there's a 100% modifier you can see on the right. And once that goes down to 0, the clue is gone forever. A clue can be claimed by someone, in which case it decays much slower in their inventory. Once a clue is claimed by someone, it loses half of its strength in the location. So in other words, the first person to grab it has the highest chance of looking through it and getting the most information. Okay, so that's the detail panes. And next we're going to be looking at the points of interest, the other parts of the location, as well as talking about the infiltration.